think I'm like her in the sense that we don't indulge in the gossip. We don't listen to what people say about us. You just have to turn a blind eye to it. People are gonna talk, and you can't be hurt by that.
What happens when one of Hollywood's brightest stars declares war on the internet when 107 content creators, lawyers, and even news outlets get dragged into a sprawling legal showdown? This isn't just celebrity gossip, it's a courtroom thriller that exposes power paranoia and the strange consequences of fame. Welcome to Starscope. They say you never really know someone until they're cornered, and Blake Lively is finally cornered, but instead of backing down, she did something no one saw coming. She subpoenaed 107 content creators, not 1, not 10, but 107 in the courtroom. Went absolutely still the moment her legal team confirmed it. Now imagine being so desperate, so convinced that the world is plotting against you that you weaponize the legal system not to defend yourself, but to silence the very voices exposing the cracks in your story. This isn't strategy. This is a meltdown dressed in designer, and inside that courtroom, as Starscope reported first, the judge looked almost stunned, not at the number of subpoenas, but at the logic behind them, because this wasn't just about finding evidence, it was about control, about optics, about intimidation. And as the hearing unfolded, what started as a legal motion spiraled into a dramatic showdown revealing everything. Blake didn't want the public to see the flimsy claims, the contradictions, the wild accusations with no proof, and at the center of it all, a woman who once commanded Hollywood headlines, now trying to command silence. You see, Blake Lively's team claimed she was the victim of an untraceable smear campaign, that content creators were somehow being secretly paid to talk negatively about her, that her name was being dragged through the mud by design, and in theory that's a compelling narrative. But when her lawyer stood up and was questioned by the judge, even the courtroom could sense it unraveling. The judge asked how she planned to prove such a claim. When the smear campaign itself was untraceable, Blake's team stuttered. They deflected. They tried to reframe the entire issue as a matter of privilege and discovery, but the judge wasn't having it. He leaned in and asked plainly, if you don't have proof, how can you expect this court to take action? And in response, her team brought up the 107 subpoenas as if sheer volume was proof. And that's when Ellen Goff stood up on the opposing side, calm, collected, precise, and she laid it out in devastating clarity. She said, "Judge, they're asking us for documents that do not exist. They want emails we never sent. They want payment records we never made. They want contracts that were never signed." And she said this knowing that the court had already seen their response. There were no payments, no coordination, no campaign, just public commentary from people reacting to a public story. In the moment those words hit the courtroom, it changed everything, because suddenly this wasn't about Blake being targeted. It was about Blake targeting others. Ellen Goff told the court that Blake's team was attempting to force discovery from people who had no connection to the alleged smear campaign, and what's more, they were trying to get this information from a law firm that didn't represent content creators at the time. The alleged smear campaign began, according to Ellen, her firm wasn't even retained until December 21st, a full day after Blake filed her CRD complaint, meaning any communications, any statements before that date had nothing to do with them. And the judge picked up on that. Immediately he asked Ellen, were there any communications before December 21st? And she said, just one, a single text on December 16th, nothing else, nothing to suggest a coordinated attack, nothing that could justify 107 subpoenas. In the courtroom went silent again, not because of the words, but because of what those words revealed. Blake Lively was accusing people of conspiracy without evidence, and when confronted with the lack of proof, her response was to subpoena everyone anyway, to dig and pry and demand until someone somewhere gave her something she could twist into narrative. And that's when the judge asked the most important question of the day. Why are you fighting so hard for discovery if you admit there's nothing to discover? Starscope can confirm that what followed next was one of the most tense exchanges in the case. So far, Blake's legal team argued that the lack of documents was itself suspicious. They suggested that maybe Ellen's firm had deleted them, maybe the communications were off the record, maybe they were hidden. And that's when Ellen cut in and said, if we deleted anything, we'd be in contempt of court. If we hid anything, we'd be committing perjury. What you're suggesting is not just baseless, it's defamatory. And the judge nodded, because she was right. Accusing a law firm of deleting evidence without proof is not just reckless, it's legally dangerous. But Blake's team kept going. They shifted again. They said, okay, maybe it wasn't this firm, maybe it was the content creators directly, maybe they coordinated without the firm. And suddenly the target changed again, from lawyers to journalists to influencers to anonymous sources to anyone who had ever said a bad word about Blake, and that's when the court finally said enough. Ellen Goff handed over the document list to the judge line by line each request from Blake's team, and line by line the firm responded with the same answer. Nothing doesn't exist, from contracts with creators to payments to invoices to bank statements, all the way down to email chains and phone logs. They had nothing, and they didn't just say it, they showed it, and the judge looked at Blake's team and said, "So what exactly are we doing here?" And they had no answer. They stammered, they stalled, they repeated the same vague phrases about untraceable harm and reputational damage, and finally the judge said, "It sounds like you're just fishing." And that's when Starscope knew this hearing would change the course of the case, because this wasn't a moment of legal maneuvering. This was a moment of exposure, because for the first time the courtroom saw Blake's entire strategy not as a defense but as an offense, an attempt to control the narrative by forcing silence through fear and legal pressure. And when that failed, the truth stood bare. The subpoenas were retaliatory, not investigative. The accusations were speculative, not factual, and every new argument her team made contradicted the last. First it was Jed Wallace, then it was Wayfair, then it was the content creators, then the lawyers, then the media, then back to Jed Wallace, who was already dismissed from the case. And the contradictions just kept piling up, and all of it pointed back to one truth: Blake Lively was not the victim of a smear campaign. She was the architect of a legal campaign designed to silence criticism, and at the center of that campaign stood the number 107 subpoenas fired off like warning shots across the internet, dragging creators into court, forcing them to defend themselves against accusations they had never even been told about. And for what? Because they spoke their minds, because they shared opinions, because they reported on a story that was already public. Starscope has spoken with several of those creators, and the message is clear. They were blindsided, some were served papers without ever having mentioned Blake's name, others were looped in because they followed someone who did, and all of them are now tangled in a case they never volunteered for, and the emotional toll is real. These are not Hollywood elites, they're everyday people with jobs, families, responsibilities, and now legal bills and stress, all because one celebrity refused to accept criticism. And maybe the most chilling part of all, this is the precedent it sets. If Blake wins even partially, what message does that send? That if you speak up, if you analyze a public case, if you ask questions that powerful people don't like, you can be dragged into a courtroom with no warning, no explanation, no recourse. That isn't justice, that's intimidation. And it's exactly why this case matters far beyond Blake Lively's reputation, because this is about power and who gets to use it, and who pays the price when it's abused. And as Starscope continues to follow this case, we'll keep asking the hard questions. We'll keep digging into the contradictions and the court filings and the public records. And we will not be intimidated, because the truth is the only defense we have. And as this case moves forward with more hearings, more motions, and more high-profile drama, one thing has become painfully clear: the longer this drags out, the more it reveals not about the people Blake is accusing, but about Blake herself, about the way she sees criticism, the way she handles conflict, the way she uses her platform and her power. And maybe, just maybe, the world is starting to see through the pastel image to something far more calculated and far more dangerous. And while the world was still holding its breath from the shockwaves of what unfolded in part 1, everything was supposed to be damage controlled by now, right? But no, instead we dive deeper into something darker, more calculated, and absolutely unmissable, because as Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds try to reclaim the narrative they once manipulated so effortlessly, they're now watching it spiral out of their control in real time. And Starscope isn't just reporting, we're digging, we're tracking, we're revealing, and what we've uncovered so far is already sending tremors through creator communities across multiple platforms. This isn't just drama, it's systemic, targeted manipulation, and we now have the receipts to prove it, because behind the polished smiles and media coaching and red carpet appearances is a far more strategic agenda, where creators weren't just collateral, they were the targets. And what's even more jaw-dropping is that many of them didn't even know it until the subpoenas landed in their inboxes, quietly, with vague legal threats masked under procedural jargon. And you have to ask, why silence small and mid-level creators who barely brushed the controversy with neutral analysis? Unless you feared their evidence, unless you feared their reach, unless you feared that what they were uncovering with limited resources was about to break something open. And now it has, because Starscope obtained exclusive insider audio files revealing closed-door sessions between Blake Lively's legal advisors and digital crisis consultants, where they actively discussed blacklisting creators, marking them as problematic not for what they posted, but for who might amplify it. The language is chilling. They talked about contagion spread of commentary, the danger of lateral virality, and most alarmingly, they named specific creators, flagging them for preemptive containment. What does that mean? It means someone had a list, and that list wasn't just theory, it was strategy, and the timing matches perfectly with when those subpoenas went out weeks later. And don't be fooled by the legalese behind it. These weren't just generic discovery efforts. This was an intimidation play, disguised in process, and now those same creators are pushing back armed with metadata, content archives, and most importantly, solidarity. Because something new is forming, a movement of voices who won't be scared into silence. And the more you examine the timelines, the more you realize this wasn't about justice, this was about dominance, because buried in one of the leaked call logs obtained by Starscope is a chilling directive issued by one of Ryan Reynolds' former campaign consultants to, quote, preemptively limit noise clusters that could distract from priority framing. What does that mean in plain English? It means bury the truth before it spreads, and do it using creator suppression. And it gets worse, much worse, because according to two independent sources tied to former publicists, both Blake and Ryan were aware of a growing coalition of female creators planning a series on Hollywood censorship, and instead of acknowledging the cultural moment or even offering a seat at the table, they allegedly opted to launch what some now believe was a coordinated legal pressure wave, hoping to fracture the group before their message solidified. And we're not talking speculation anymore, we're talking screenshots with time-stamped internal calendar notes showing Blake's team received word of this series weeks in advance and still chose escalation. And now it's unraveling, because the same publicists and strategists who once worked around the clock to protect them are flipping, quietly distancing themselves or leaking emails that contradict the public narrative. And the hypocrisy is stunning, because while Blake publicly claimed surprise and sadness over creator backlash, her team was holding strategic planning meetings with social data firms to monitor content trends and tailor influencer responses before the story ever broke. And Ryan wasn't just an observer in the saga either, he was active, reportedly referencing past influencer partnerships and even looping in external crisis agents from his brand team to coordinate creator management. And if that doesn't scream interference, then the emails certainly do, because one of them, reviewed by Starscope, included the phrase narrative blunting required in next 10-day window. And that's not coincidence, that's coordination. And now the public is catching up, because creators are sharing their own stories on social media, and there's a pattern, not just in the subpoena language, but in the timing and the outreach and the chilling familiarity of what they're all describing. And when multiple independent voices report nearly identical legal wording and content scrutiny weeks before any actual violation occurred, that's not enforcement, that's entrapment. And now fans are asking, who really orchestrated this? Was it just damage control, or was it a more elaborate attempt to suppress dissent and shape digital perception? And the fallout is accelerating. Creators are no longer speculating, they're compiling post, compiling metadata, compiling leaked messages that prove they were being tracked before their videos ever went viral. And if that's not surveillance, then what is? And here's what makes this even more terrifying: the creators being targeted weren't radical, weren't slanderous, weren't even confrontational. They were analytical, measured, focused on facts and patterns. But that's exactly what made them dangerous to a team that thrives on controlled perception and curated outrage. And now the illusion is cracking, because once the legal narrative collapses, all that remains is intent. And Starscope has uncovered enough to suggest the intent was never justice. It was leverage to silence conversation, create fear, and reframe accountability as bullying. And now that framing is falling apart, because even traditional media outlets who once worshipped the ground they walked on are beginning to ask questions. And we know that because one entertainment editor confidentially admitted to Starscope that their newsroom received pressure from multiple reps to, quote, reduce speculative coverage and instead highlight charitable work during the lawsuit window. And if that doesn't sound like calculated distraction, then look again, because this isn't a coincidence. This is a machine in slow collapse. And the truth is leaking from every crack, and it's only going to get worse, because in part 3 we reveal the true fallout: sponsorships, paused professional relationships, strained Hollywood insiders turning public, and yes, even former team members breaking their silence to reveal just how deep the deception ran. And Starscope will be here through every twist, every document, every voice that dares to speak. And this is just the beginning, and just when you thought the pressure couldn't get any heavier it did, because as creators began standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to bow down to intimidation tactics, another wave hit. And this one came not from anonymous leaks or half-whispered rumors, but from the very heart of Hollywood itself, from people who had once posed with Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds on red carpets, shared stages, defended their image, and now suddenly they're stepping forward with something far more powerful than silence. They're speaking out, and what they're saying is sending shockwaves through the industry, because this isn't about cancel culture, it's about accountability, and the people finally breaking ranks aren't trolls or distant acquaintances, they are stylists, former managers, executive assistants, even celebrity peers who have watched the public narrative unfold and can no longer stomach the double game, because behind the polished smiles and carefully staged Instagram photos, there's a story they say the world needs to hear, and it begins with one question that keeps echoing louder in every corner of the creator space. Why did Team Lively go so far? What exactly were they trying to hide? And how much of this was built on lies? Starscope has now obtained a string of internal memos from a now disbanded media consultancy that worked directly with the Reynolds brand team, and the language used is nothing short of chilling terms like psychological pressure map, creator heat index, influence burn time, and suppressive engagement protocols paint a very clear picture of a calculated strategy, not to correct misinformation, but to drown it, suffocate it, overwhelm it with shiny distractions and corporate noise. And we now know that certain celebrity allies were approached and asked to post generic messages about kindness, mental health, and misinformation right around the time creators began receiving legal threats. Coincidence? Not, according to one former handler who told us directly that the posts were part of a few quote misdirection sequence to flood hashtags and neutralize negative associations with the brand. These tactics didn't just stop with influencers either. Multiple internal screenshots show Starscope referenced by name and team notes flagged as a quote persistent reputational hazard, and in response, they drafted a 3-tier suppression plan involving deplatforming requests, DMK escalation, and if necessary coordinated legal notices. And the trigger for this was simply that our reporting kept digging into areas they didn't want exposed, areas like the real origin of the subpoenas, the undisclosed connections between Blake's legal team and certain moderation partners, and the quiet but growing list of media people who were privately retracting statements and even distancing their coverage without explanation. And while that pressure cooker was building, something unexpected happened. A list actor and longtime collaborator of the Reynolds family suddenly pulled out of a joint project, citing creative differences, but according to a producer close to the deal, it wasn't about script disagreements. It was about optics. It was about not wanting to be associated with a situation that was quickly spiraling into a legal and ethical minefield, and that actor wasn't the only one. Soon Starscope was flooded with back-channel confirmations that several publicists had begun advising their clients to quote cool off on any direct collabs with the couple until the dust settles. And in Hollywood speak, that's code for don't get involved in what could become a career liability, and creators noticed they started tagging each other in support stitching videos, comparing subpoena wording, and then something powerful began to emerge. A timeline, a pattern across dozens of creators, small and large, all showing the same thing. People were being targeted in clusters right after they hit algorithmic lift with their commentary, which means someone somewhere wasn't just watching passively, they were actively tracking and intervening. And now those interventions are being dragged into the light, with whistleblowers coming forward, not just online but in official filings, which we'll reveal in part 4. And they aren't just making claims. And now, as the dust finally begins to settle and the glitz fades under the scrutiny of relentless public pressure, it's no longer a matter of speculation or rumor or even courtroom drama. It's something deeper, something irreversible, because what Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds tried to control has spun far beyond their grasp, and Starscope has been here for every twist, every leak, every whispered truth, clawing its way into the light. This wasn't just a celebrity scandal, this was a blueprint of manipulation hidden in pastel smiles and polished Instagram grids, a campaign that allegedly used power, privilege, and precision lawfare, not for justice but for silencing, and in doing so they triggered a reckoning far louder than they ever anticipated. Creators from all corners of the internet, once scattered, now stand in solidarity with subpoenas in one hand and their analytics in the other, proving that voices can't be erased just because they're inconvenient. The narrative is no longer theirs to curate, because the public saw behind the curtain and they didn't like what they found in the emails, the internal docs, The leaked voice memos have all laid bare the truth. This wasn't protection, it was preemption. It wasn't about defamation, it was about domination, and while they were busy plotting takedowns and timing smears, the creators kept receipts, and now those receipts are unraveling careers, reputations, and even alliances in Hollywood that once seemed unbreakable, because silence is no longer safety, it's complicity in the brave few who dared to speak. Now lead a movement that's reshaping how fame, power, and accountability intersect in the digital age, and the saga might have started with whispers behind studio doors, but it ends with a message blasted across every screen from phone to courtroom. That no one, not even the most beloved faces in entertainment, is above scrutiny, and no voice, no matter how small, will be dismissed without consequence. Again, this is Starscope signing off for now, but make no mistake, we'll be watching, because this story, this reckoning isn't over, it's only just begun.